Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back. Black.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are honored today to be joined by Professor Deirdre Cooper Owens, who's an associate professor of history and Africana studies at the University of Connecticut in Storrs. She's the author of Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, published by the University of Georgia Press in 2017, the winner of the Darlene Clark Hine Award from the Organization of American Historians. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you for having me.
So glad to finally have you on Left of Black. And I gotta say this, I think that for most Americans, before 2017, they had no idea who James Marion Sims is.
None.
Now they're little 5-minute videos for K through 12 kids.
Yep.
And yet this is someone who had been largely unknown, except for folks really doing medical history.
That's right.
To most Americans, that has had such a dramatic impact on black women,
Right.
Their reproductive rights, and the science of gynecology.
Right.
Talk a little bit how you got to this project.
It's black women brought me here. I was sharing with you before, I'm a graduate of Bennett College. It's one of the 2 historically black colleges for women. And at the time, I was in grad school in Los Angeles, and I've always had a big mouth. So I was asked by the Bennett alum to moderate a panel with Janetta Cole, who was our then president, and Reverend James Lawson, the civil rights pioneer. So, you know, any good student does her homework. And Dr. Cole and Dr. Beverly Guy Sheftel, one of the architects of black feminist thought and womanism, had written a book called Gender Talk.
Yes.
So I'm reading the book, and 2 to 3 sentences struck me. They said, here's this guy, father of American gynecology, James Marion Sims. I'm thinking, I'd never heard of him. I do 19th century US history. And then a couple of sentences later, they talked about his experimentation on enslaved women in Alabama, and it blew me away. I was taking a class in the history of science, and I'm thinking, I'm so tired of hearing about the steam engine and the scientific revolution and Britain. How can I write a research paper for this class? And I remember going to the professors and I said, hey, there's this guy who experimented on enslaved women. I had only heard about Tuskegee. This was 2005.
Right.
There was no Henrietta Lacks books, and nothing.
Right.
So they said, well, you know, we don't know if there'll be much. You know, the enslaved women didn't leave written records. I was like, okay, tell me what I can't do. As a long story short, I commenced to finding out about the lives of these women and realized James Marion Sims was not alone. Yeah.
That response from your professors, enslaved women didn't document their history. As a researcher, that's a challenge for you.
Oh, yeah.
Right. I mean, not just a challenge in the sense it's a challenge to do that, but it's like a throwing down of the gauntlet.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Right. I dare you to find
That's right.
some stuff in the archive.
That's right.
And what did you find in the archive?
I mean, that's the thing. When you are a historian of slavery, I mean, it kind of doesn't matter, right? In the Americas, you're not going to find written records. I mean, literacy was deemed illegal in slaveholding spaces. But what I learned from, you know, taking classes about black women's history or women's studies, gender studies classes, you have to read between the lines. You have to read those silences. And so as these white medical men of the 18th and 19th century were writing their case narratives in medical journals or textbooks or even their own memoirs, I was reading about the ways that enslaved women would respond to the surgeries, to their treatment. And so that became really important for me. And so I reread the text, you know, as best I could from the perspective of pivoting and centering the enslaved women as the central characters.
Right.
And so a lot emerged when I started to read those texts written by the men who owned or leased them very differently. Yeah.
This is a book that had a seismic impact on how we talk about black women, how we talk about black women's history. You are part of a cohort of black women historians that have really fundamentally changed and reimagined what black studies is in this moment. When you first published this book, what kind of impact did you think it was going to have?
I thought 10 people, including 5 of my family members, would read it, like any other academic. And, so that was the realistic part of me saying, okay, 10 people will buy it. I think it's solid enough to get me tenure. But the dreamer side of me that I never lost touch with was like, I think maybe this can be used. I mean, I can say this now because I'm tenured, but I said, well, maybe doctors or hospitals, folk who are fighting for reparative justice can use this book, as a source for documenting, systemic abuses that have happened. That's what I thought. And then I realized that the book wasn't really being promoted in the ways that I want, but I grew up in the 80s and the 90s. And so the folk I grew up in, around in South Carolina and Southeast DC, they sold things like from trunks and whatever. So I remember calling my press like, look, I'm out here, I'm selling these books.
You got on your mixtape
like
hustle.
I was like, what you got for me? We need to go out here and let these people know, about this book. I didn't know that's what you were not supposed to do, but that was fine. They supported me. And once a young group of people in New York, I was living there at the time, went viral with a video of their protest in front of the Sims statue in Central Park, I think that's when everything kind of exploded. And I was no longer an assistant professor of African American history at Queens College. It was this transformation almost overnight, like the country's foremost expert on James Marion Sims, and so I knew at that moment I had to really center black women.
You're a historian of the 19th century, but this is a project that doesn't allow you to stay in the 19th century, right? So you're often called upon to comment on, what is a black maternity crisis in the 21st century, thinking about the Olympic sprinter who passed away, right? Should have been in peak physical condition, right? We know the narratives of people like Serena Williams, and it's it's not the famous and well known and the award winning, right? It's the hundreds of thousands of black women who have this experience, right? Who we don't know their names or their stories. How do you read this connection between this earlier history of a figure like Sims and this continued crisis, right? Because I'm thinking about that moment with Sims and the challenge that those women had to speak back to their pain.
That's right.
And Sims is oblivious to it. He can't hear it, right? And now when black women actually can push back, folks still can't hear them through their pain.
Yeah, that is the crux, right? It really is about the enduring legacy, but also attractiveness, the sexiness of anti-blackness that folk like you and I in the humanities and the social sciences, we've been writing about this, studying this for decades, and the allure of anti-blackness is so entrenched that it's really hard for sometimes well-intentioned folk to disavow themselves from that. And so what I tend to do in a lot of my consultations or my speeches with the medical folk, and I mean from doulas, midwives, OBGYNs, lactation specialists, nurses, it runs the gamut, the administrators. What I do is I show them several studies and I juxtapose that with findings from the antebellum era, so from the 1850s or 30s. And what those studies show from the 21st century, I'm not pulling things from the late 20th, I'm like, we can stay squarely in the 21st century. What I'm showing them is that a lot of white students who are medical students or residents, even some of the doctors, MDs themselves, nurses, have the same beliefs that black people are biologically distinctive from white people, that Black people have thicker skin, that Black people don't experience pain.
Higher tolerance.
Higher tolerances of pain. And when they do, they're feigning illness so that they can get opiates or narcotics.
Or out of work.
Right. And so when they're finding that some of the same findings that men like Samuel Cartwright wrote about in the 19th century are some of the beliefs that people have in the 21st century, they're really shocked. And I'm saying the stats speak for themselves. The U.S. has remained the most dangerous place for Black women and birthing people to not only give birth, but to be pregnant. And so, a part of what I do, I'm never going to be on the corner with a bullhorn. That's not my ministry or my gift. But what I can do is advocate for curriculum change and design, help with the creation of learning modules so that the books that we write about race and racism are not electives, but that they're part of the curriculum of these schools.
You are a responsible scholar, a historian. I imagine for you, you have no choice than to do this work with these medical staffs, with these institutions. There must be a different responsibility that you feel to young Black women.
Oh, yeah.
Right, who are starting families. What are those conversations like for you these days?
I tend to partner with the institutions. So that what that means are Black doula organizations.
Right, right.
So I'm largely in conversation more so with the activists or the leaders. But when people share their stories, it's always, it's unsettling for me because you don't want to see this person who's young and, like you said, right on the precipice of mothering actively, with the person outside of their bodies expressing fear. Kind of being mired in a state of shock and disbelief at the ways that they've been ignored or treated. And so I think for a part of my own emotional and psychological health, it's much easier for me to speak with the folk who are running the doula organizations, the people who have the birthing centers, who are midwives, because I don't know if my soul can take that kind of hurt and pain. And so it's much easier for me, I think, to compartmentalize and say, okay, at least I know I can help raise money or create, learning opportunities in these ways, to speak on behalf of these organizations. Those kinds of things I find are much more healthy for me to be a reproductive justice advocate as opposed to activist.
My oldest daughter had our first grandchild back in June. She and her husband made a conscious choice to use a birthing center.
That's right.
And not a hospital. It seems, again, almost in line with the publication of your book, this explosion of birthing centers and Black doula organizations. Right. How important have these organizations, right? And this is the thing, right? They've been around for years.
For years.
Right? But we're just, they're visible to us now in a way that they hadn't been before.
Yeah, and they're outside of states like just Colorado or California. Like that's the other thing. When I was a grad student at UCLA and I first learned of a doula from my husband's cousin, a Black woman who grew up in Inglewood, I was like, a doula, what's that? Like, what is that? And I just said, these California hippies. And, I had never heard of anything like that. I knew what a midwife was, but what is that? And then in New York, so I first began the work in Mississippi in 2010. But back then, you were really afraid to be out front because it was dangerous. It was the first time I was doxxed and trolled and had to get the university police department and all of those things. So we tended to do reproductive justice work from the shadows.
Right.
In New York, though, especially after the publication of my book, there were two Black doulas who were really well known. Chanel Portia, who was based in Brooklyn. In fact, I lived right down the street from her doula organization. And Latham Thomas, known as Mama Glow. And they were like, sis, you're on the curriculum, so you need to do some work outside of your classroom stuff.
Yeah.
And there's a real fear. As you know, people equate anything dealing with reproductive justice as just abortion work.
Right.
And so
Right.
it becomes very dangerous. And, you know, as they reached out to me, I was like, how can I not? And I also knew that people pay attention when you, and it's sad when you have a couple of letters behind your name. And so they were like, we need you to do these things. We need you to advocate. We need you to work with these institutions, these schools who don't respect what we do, who don't honor what we do. And so I was like, okay, I can do that. And so it's been wonderful. But they were the ones who really brought me out to the forefront. So I always give props to Lathan and to Chanel, who are now out here,
Right.
you know, doing their thing and impact in New York, and also helping that state form a partnership with doula organizations where these birth workers can also be compensated,
Right.
which is important.
When you go into the archive, was there a story in the archive, an experience that you engaged that fundamentally shook you
Yeah.
in a way that you had to actually give yourself pause to wonder if you could continue
Ooh, yeah.
with the project because of the depth of the
Yeah.
trauma of it?
Yeah, I will tell you the kind of deepness of anti-Blackness. As someone who also grew up in the South and in the hood of DC, I had an expectation that Black people would not be treated well, especially enslaved Black people
Right.
going into the
Right.
archives. Rarely shocked. I mean, there were a few things. One was finding a very aged enslaved woman named Rose, and I saw her on the ledger with like desks and animals, and she was the lowest priced object for $1. And I remember I was in a library in South Carolina, and I remember having to just pack up for the day because I couldn't imagine all of the work, forced labor that she gave to this family and being priced at $1 because she was aged, you know, and just kind of, they were doing everything they could to get rid of her. So that was one thing where I was shaken to the core. But I will tell you the thing that made me stop writing for about 2 weeks, and when I was in grad school, my fourth chapter is on Irish immigrant women, because Sims then, when he moves to New York and the Black population is smaller, obviously, than in Alabama, he begins work on these very poor Irish immigrant women. And there was this one woman, she never went to his hospital, but just kind of living in tenements. Her husband had been a professional in Ireland, but just wasn't able to find work, like many immigrants today. And so she goes out kind of against her husband's wishes to beg for food and relief. So she leaves with one of his friends who takes her to an almshouse. And when she comes back, she is shocked that her husband has committed suicide. So they find him, he's committed suicide. So of course she has to take care of that. She comes back, she sees more emergency vehicles, and her youngest child died of starvation. And after that, I was like, okay, you know, I can't do this anymore. But then I began to kind of really wrestle with, what was it about reading about this Irish immigrant woman and her family that shook me? And, you know, as a Black person, as a Southerner, as someone who is a descendant of formerly enslaved people, I'm like, I wasn't necessarily shaken in the same way. And so there was a kind of internal conversation I had to have and a reckoning. And that's when I understood the reaches and the depths of anti-Blackness.
We're desensitized.
That's right, that you become so desensitized to it, that is the thing that shook me. You know, and so I had to really have some real conversations with myself about, you know, how do you write this history in a state of trying to protect yourself, not necessarily having the same sort of emotional investment. And so that was difficult for me. Yeah.
How do you feel about the book now?
You know, I am proud of the little book that could.
And still talking about it
and
6 years
still
later.
talking about it 6 years later. I'm proud of the little book that could. You know, of course, I think it's a first book. there are always things you wish you could improve upon, and you find the typos and those kinds of things. But I'm glad that it's a history book that was able to leave the classroom in the best way.
I like that.
And so, you know, for many of us who've come into my field, which is history, which is pretty traditional and conservative, I still had a training in African American studies at Clark Atlanta. And we were always taught, you know, if you want to produce knowledge and scholarship for scholarship's sake or knowledge's sake, go on ahead, do that. But for those of us in that program in the late 90s, you know, the kind of age of Afrocentricity, we knew that there had to be social value and political value. And so it feels really good to see.
Accessibility.
That's right, and accessibility. And so I began with telling stories. And that's been critiqued by lots of people. You know, oh, that's a dumbing down of the field. And I'm like, that's how most people are brought into understanding and liking Black history, is through the stories. So there's a lot of narrative storytelling in the book.
Yeah, I was reading a great piece, a classic piece by Barbara Christian on the race with theory, teaching in my intro to African American Studies course, right? And she's saying, like, folks are trying to all this. We've always done theory.
That's right.
It's in our songs, it's in our poems, it's in our stories, right?
Yeah.
So you mentioned, you know, this emergence, at least in visibility, of doulas. And of course, historically, doulas have been around, and midwives.
That's right.
There still feels as though there's a stigma, generally from the medical profession, but I would even argue from some older conservative Black folks about the use of midwives and doulas, right?
Yeah.
How do we challenge, you know, that stigma that's associated with these folks who've become really important to think about healthy reproduction in the Black community?
Yeah, you know, so this is the thing, number one, kind of defining what a doula does, because lots of people don't know. And so you would think, well, they're not medical workers in the sense of catching babies like a midwife, right? So they're not going to nursing school or interning in the same ways. But what doulas do is they advocate for the patients, for these mothers and these birthing people. And so when you have a labor and delivery nurse or a obstetrician who is, you know, we are the experts, and there is this hierarchy, and then you have this person saying, wait, you know, this patient is saying, I'm in pain, or I feel uncomfortable, or perhaps they have a history of sexual abuse. The doula is there to advocate and to make the person's life easier. The doctors and the nurses who have this kind of resistance are really responding to, you are disrupting the power dynamic here. And that's really what it's about. And there have been, your colleague Jennifer Nash makes a wonderful point in her book, Birthing Black Mothers, that even some midwives do not like working with doulas, because once again, it's this disruption of who's in charge. And that's not always the case, you know, but it happens. And so what I'm finding for larger urban areas, you know, so San Francisco, Baltimore, New York, those kinds of places, they're recognizing that Black women trust having someone to navigate those spaces and advocate for them. And so they've had to form partnerships with doulas and midwives. What's concerning for me, and this is something that hasn't really been discussed in ways I think it should be amplified. I'm really concerned about Black women and birthing people who live in the Black Belt South, particularly in rural areas, who don't have access to these doulas. And so there's no disruption, you know, of the power dynamics. There's no advocacy because people want to live in cities. And there are just more resources for poor people in cities. You know, there's a big difference between country poor and city poor. And so, you know, growing up in a place when I was in high school that had less than 4,000 people, we didn't even have a maternity ward by the time I graduated high school. And so these are the things that I think we also should be concerned about as well. Not just the resistance, but they need to be in places where Black people are.
I'm paying attention to your use of language and your use of the term birthing people.
Yes.
Can you expand upon that for folks in the audience who might not have heard that phrase before?
I sure can. And so this is the language that many folk in reproductive justice have taken on. It does not displace women who become pregnant at all. So you will hear me say and. I'm sure to use the conjunction and. But birthing people are for folk who might be trans or non-binary. And my thing is, I respect what folk want to be called. You know, I respect people's pronouns and their identities and all of those things. And so it's just a way of me saying, even if the numbers are very small, if you've made your presence known and that's how you want to be referred to, it takes nothing for me but a second to say, and birthing people, and keep it moving. Yeah.
What's next for you?
What is next is, as I was sharing with you a little earlier, kind of getting comfortable again with my nerdy side where I can just read and write and do research. And I'm working on 2 monographs right now. One is, it's a different kind of story because someone who was born in slavery dies free and dies celebrated. And so I'm writing a monograph on Harriet Tubman, but I'm looking at her through the lens of disability. Harriet Tubman always spoke about her illnesses, her conditions. You know, of course, people in the 19th century didn't use the term disability, but in today's age, that's what she would be considered. And so I'm writing this really interesting and fun biography of her life, but also looking at her as a model who left a blueprint for us on how to institution build, what democracy was really about. And even sharing a little bit about her life as a woman that, you know, she was married twice and the second husband was about 25 years younger. And, you know, I mean, you know, Harriet had it going on in lots of ways. So that's a fun project. And then the third project is much closer to medical bondage. It seems like I can't leave this history of medicine field now. That's how I'm kind of seen and defined. And anyway, that book is about the history of the C-section and medical discovery, and this guy, Dr. Francois-Marie Provost, who was French-born, experimented on enslaved women in both Haiti and Louisiana. But this is the real interesting part, where I'm always talking about James Marion Sims is not exceptional as being a cohort of men who did this kind of work, exploitative work on Black women's bodies. Provost first performed his 2 experimental C-sections on enslaved women in Donaldsonville, Louisiana, right outside of Baton Rouge in 1831, even naming one of the women's children. From 1831 until the 21st century, Louisiana remains the #1 state for the overuse of C-sections on Black women and birthing people's bodies until another state with a little larger Black population knocks it to #2, and that was Mississippi. And that only happened about 2 or 3 years ago. So that'll be the third project.
We've been joined by Professor Deirdre Cooper Owens, Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at the University of Connecticut, the author of the critically acclaimed and very much important Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, published by the University of Georgia Press, 2017. Thank you for spending some time with us on Left to Black.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record